Lord Moore, Charles, welcome to Lord Speaker's podcast. It's a pleasure to have you along.
Thank you, I'm honoured to be here.
On that. I usually start with the backstory of members. I know you were born in 1956, East Sussex, and your parents, I think both, were of the Liberal tradition, and your mother was a councillor.
Absolutely, and my father was a multiple failed Liberal candidate, so he stood at about 12 elections, I would say.
General elections?
General elections and European elections.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And always choosing seats which he couldn't win, but very contented to have the battle. So yes, I was brought up in a Liberal with a big L household, strongly so, yeah.
Then you went to Oxford,
Cambridge,
Cambridge. Did Trinity,
yeah.
and you did English and history.
Correct, yeah.
But you seem to shed the Liberal heritage pretty quickly.
I would say that in certain respects I'm Liberal with a small L, and I'm not very party-minded anyway, and I'm a non-affiliated peer. But I am more conservative than my parents with a small c, and it was a time of some sort of political intellectual ferment when I was at university in the 1970s, because old Labour was sort of running out of road, you know, when we were running up to the period of the winter of discontent and so on, and there was a feeling that socialism wasn't going anywhere. And then Mrs Thatcher came along while she was made leader just before I went, leader but not Prime Minister, just before I went to university, and that was all interesting, and Keith Joseph and all the rethink. Yeah. And I wasn't involved in politics at university at all, actually, but I was following all that, and we were debating all these questions. And my studies also, reading writers like Edmund Burke and so on, made me, in that sense, conservative. There, I suppose, I've more or less remained.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Edmund Burke, if I remember correctly, said that members of Parliament were not delegates,
Indeed.
But representatives. So I think you would adhere to that principle.
Very much so, yes. And his famous address to the electors of Bristol, rather like Tony Benn being a keen Bristol member, yes, exactly so.
I remember Jonathan Syed. He was a Conservative MP, you probably remember him, but he did represent Bristol.
Yeah.
And I knew Jonathan quite well. And when he was campaigning to oust Tony Benn, he knocked his door, and the householder said, "Great, I'm supporting you, don't worry, Mr. Benn," you know. So, but he didn't correct her that he was standing for the Conservative Party. so there you are. But you're a practicing Anglican. And then you were a practicing Anglican.
I was, yes, yeah.
And then in 1992, you converted to Catholicism,
yes,
I believe.
Yes.
What led that?
Well, I suppose the usual thing in Britain about this, frequent in conversion, is it's often to do with studying the works of John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman. Some Christians are understandably not interested in what the true church is. They're more directly considering their own relationship with God. But I've always thought that what the church is very important in being a Christian. Otherwise, it's very hard to get guidance and to understand. And I felt that the Church of England, reading Newman and so on, I felt the Church of England, which has many virtues, was not, as it's sometimes put, the society which Jesus intended. And I decided that, as many have, that the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, was the true church, and therefore it seemed you had to be in it. And it had a good effect. I mean, apart from the most important good effect, it had a secondary good effect, which is I became fonder of the Church of England once I'd left it, because I didn't have to get engaged in all these wretched arguments and I've carefully avoided, as a Catholic, internal religious arguments, which I think are very destructive.
Has your depth of faith, or whatever we call it, increased over the years since you've become a Catholic? I mean, are you really embedded in the Catholic faith, you feel now? It's progressed?
I'm not a good Catholic, but I'm an observant Catholic. So
ditto.
It's not easy to be a good Catholic, but I go to Mass and I serve at Mass, and I'm regular, and I'm interested, and I follow things.
You mentioned Cardinal Newman, his essay on the development of Christian doctrine in 1845.
Yes.
He said that to live is to change, and to change often is to be perfect. Now, looking at your background and your excellent journalistic skills and views, it doesn't seem to me that you've changed much. Is that a bit unfair?
I think it is a bit unfair, but I think Newman himself, after all, the exposition of that book is in certain respects a conservative one. He's not saying his idea of change is contained in the word development, which is, as you say, in the title of the book, and so he has a very, very strong sense of tradition. But tradition is not a rigidity which you just have to. It's not fixed. Human life is not fixed. That's, I think, what he means by change. It doesn't make him or me a constant greedy for change, but it's a simple fact of change. And any human being who doesn't try to accommodate that and live with it becomes rigid and actually miserable as well.
With the sad death of Pope Francis, I'll maybe come on to that later on, but you joined the Daily Telegraph at 23 years of age, and you were doing leader writing at 24 years of age on that. And you've obviously spent a lifetime in journalism. How has journalism changed, and how important is it? I mean, you spoke last week, I think, in the House on the issue of the Daily Telegraph and future ownership.
Well, it's in a way more important than ever because there's an absolute explosion of media. So the demand for journalism is unprecedented in the whole of human history. But what's got much harder is to work out what the best media for it is, and where the money lies and where the future lies. And of course, all newspapers have had that challenge. You know, when I joined, it was very simple. There were 3 television channels in the country, and about 12 national newspapers, and that's about it. Plus strong provincial papers, much stronger than they are now, like the Glasgow Herald or whatever. And that really was about it. And now it's endless. And so the whole subject has never mattered more, but the complications are very great. But what was very bad at the time I joined was that we were so unionized and so behind the times technologically that we couldn't do our job. And there were more and more strikes and so on. And that did change very much in the 1980s. And so by the 1990s, we had a pretty golden period from about late 80s to early 20th century, when we and many other papers were making a lot of money and developing. And now, since then, it's been more challenging. But we're doing better than we were again now, because we are finally mastering the age of the web, the online age, and we understand that the key journalistic values transfer actually quite well to a subscription-based internet world. We wasted years, not just we, but the whole trade, doing sort of clickbait things, and not really knowing how to charge for it, and losing our identity actually. And when we realised that our core printed identity can transfer with adaptation online, then I think we start to succeed, and that's been encouraging. And
you have been associated with many influential media titles, for example, The Spectator. You're the chairman of The Spectator, and editor of the Daily Telegraph for a period, and the Sunday Telegraph. You know, given that experience, what resonates with the public? How did you decide what resonates with the public on that, so that you get a message across, and you've been educational as well as reporting?
Yes. Well, first of all, whoever it was said, Lord Beaverbrook or something, you can't beat news in a newspaper. And that is primarily what people want, and they need it to be both arresting and accurate. And the trouble is, you can make it arresting by making it less accurate, so there's a danger there. And then, of course, but with that, they do want views. Views are secondary, but they do want views, and they want to air their views, and they want you to help direct or form their views, or to challenge their views, or so on. So there is that element, and I find both of those things very interesting. But the thing I always most enjoyed as editor, though I have quite a big comment background, and I am a columnist now, is getting the story that night and deciding what the front page splash is. Because then you feel that it's really new. It's new. You know, that word "new" is not accidental in news. It's new all the time. It used to be new every day. Now it's new every moment, which is pretty exhausting, but also the key to it. I think people often attack newspapers, and very understandably, there are all sorts of things we do wrong. But we do. It is an important service, and the one that the British have done very well. And it does depend, particularly with a quality paper, on trust ultimately, and that's a challenge every day. And I think on the whole, right now, trust is under threat, as it is with many institutions, and we do have to worry about that a lot. I remember a little example of this, which is not a news example, but it just shows the trust the Telegraph can inspire at its best. In our personal finance page, we carry, or particularly used to carry, it's different, a bit different now, lots and lots of advertisements for people, you know, investing in investment trusts, pensions, that sort of thing. Cut out a coupon in those days. And one day somebody cut out a coupon and sent a cheque to £1 million, for £1 million, through the post to one of our readers. And that showed to me the atmosphere the Telegraph had been able to create of trust, so that here is a thing in the Telegraph financial pages. I trust the Telegraph financial pages. I trust the advertisement that's accompanying, though not, I hope, influencing the news. And here's £1 million. I wanted my. It's an extreme example, but you see what I mean.
Yeah, I understand. This is only anecdotal, but the Telegraph has always been known for real news, above all other papers. But that reputation seems to have dropped a bit. Maybe it's the case with all papers, you know, with the media. Take, for example, we're having a discussion here, near an hour, so that we can develop issues. Now what you see, television programmes and elsewhere, it's sound bites.
Yeah.
And have the newspapers followed that in a way?
There's some truth in that. And I think all papers have got more segmented, so more sort of opinionated, including in their news coverage, and that's true right across the political spectrum. But actually, if I were to pull out an old Daily Telegraph of 1980, you would be surprised by how much less thoughtful comment there was than there is now, because we were so news-based that we didn't have room for anything else really, and we had very small it was very nuggety news, which is in many ways good, but typical front page in 1980 would have about 15 stories on it. Now it would have about 4 or 5. And this is to do with more prioritising, sometimes over-dramatising, I would say, and again, not just the Telegraph, but all papers. I know. But so yes, these are difficult issues. It is an age in all fields where you have to shout more to get attention.
And you are the official biographer of Mrs Thatcher, and I believe that she never approached you for that. There was a list and you were chosen on that, and you've gone into that in huge depth with 3 volumes as a result of that. I think you did say that Mrs Thatcher, apart from Winston Churchill, is one of the most consequential, successful Prime Ministers. Could you give us a précis of your appreciation of that, how you went about the job? Yeah,
well, no, you're sort of half right on that. She did approach me, and I didn't apply for anything. I didn't know it was in the offing, but she did approach me, and of course it was much too much of an honour and interesting opportunity to refuse, though it created some difficulties for me about how on earth was I going to manage the time. And the point about it, the reason it's so long is partly because she was a very busy lady in office for a very long time, and the hardest working Prime Minister we've ever had, probably, I should think. But also because, being the authorised biographer, I was the first person to have access to all her papers and all the government papers, because she went to Robin Butler's successor, Richard Wilson, who's also in this house now, and said, could Mr Moore be allowed to look at all the government paper before it's released to the public? And this is the key. Particularly in those days, government was conducted very largely on paper, properly recorded, much less true now. And Mrs Thatcher governed on paper. So if you want to find out what she thought about something, you just need to look at the paper that she receives, which was all preserved, you know, file after file after file. and she writes on it. These are the memos about each piece of legislation or whatever. And she writes on it very much what she says, and so it's very characteristic. So she'll write sort of feeble or something like that on the, but she'll also write in some detail about what she and what she wants. And she underlined a straight line underneath means she approves, a wiggly line means she disapproves. And so you can really get into the actual business of government, because this was all pre what Tony Blair invented, which is so-called sofa government, and paper was very much the way you did it.
So did she start sofa government, you think?
No, I think she didn't. I think she didn't really like that sort of thing. I mean, she liked gossip late at night with whiskey, but in terms of government, she really wanted to master and read the stuff. And then she wanted to go down the line, and this is the point about why she's right. She doesn't write her own memos. She writes on other people's memos, and then the private secretaries, like Charles Pole, will translate that into memos, and that goes down the line to each cabinet minister and so on. And it gets iterated and reiterated and argued and so on. And it looks very old-fashioned now, but it was extremely effective because, first of all, it was much more honest, I think, than sofa government, and clear. And also it was her way of exerting her sort of angry will. And given that government is so difficult to do, one reason that she was successful, I think, in government, whether you agree with her or not, was that she was the boss. So all this time, the sense of the angry will was pervasive, almost like an electric current in Whitehall. You know what she wants. Don't necessarily want to give it to her, but you know what she wants, and you know you'll be in trouble if you're not trying to do the work. And so that was very characteristic of her, and it was very effective. And the only Prime Minister since then who's been able to exercise some mastery, I would say, is Tony Blair, which to a lesser extent than her, but nevertheless he was. And he had also, like her, a long time.
Am I correct in that Margaret Thatcher called her Boy Blue? Am I correct in asserting that Margaret Thatcher called Tony Blair Boy Blue? I
hadn't heard that, but she certainly did say that she was proud of the fact that she had been able to change the Labour Party. You know, I mean, that's an odd thing to say, where you normally expect to change your own party, and indeed she did, but because they realised, and I'm very interested to talk to Tony Blair about this, which I did a lot for the book, is he understood, he was the first important one, he and Mandelson, the first important to understand that it was no good Labour just attacking Mrs Thatcher while she was Prime Minister. Because voters are not going to vote just because one party says the other's useless. Or you had to understand Mrs Thatcher in order to counter her, and you had to recognise that she was doing some important and valuable things as well as all the things you disagreed with, and you had to learn from her leadership example. And Blair was absolutely clear about that, and he said to me, I decided that I would realise that I'd really succeeded with the Labour Party when I could convince them to take Thatcher seriously instead of just denouncing her. And he was absolutely right about that politically, and that, of course, meant that he could break in electorally into whole new swathes of territory when it all started to go wrong for the Tories. Because instead of all that, millions of people in Britain who would never vote Labour, they sort of disintegrated under the Blair. It didn't work forever, but and he learnt so much from her in that respect.
Did she welcome challenge?
Yes, but it was quite alarming. So you mean argument?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and in fact, the first time I met her, actually, it was in this, not in the Lords, but in Parliament at a dinner, and it was about 1985. I was editor of the Spectator, and I was in my 20s. And she'd just done the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and I was critical of it because I felt it had betrayed the Unionists, and which, of course, sore point with her, because she is a Unionist, and she felt a bit guilty about it. But
did she feel Gareth Fitzgerald had an undue influence on her at that? Well,
she was a bit... The British establishment plus Gareth Fitzgerald and the Irish establishment worked closely together, and she was not really at one with them. I mean, she did agree to the agreement, obviously, and once she'd agreed to something, she will defend it like hell. So she was defending it like hell that night. But it did amuse me because she would try any trick in the book in argument to squash you. But the point was, she wasn't being horrible, and she wasn't being disdainful. She wasn't saying, look, I'm the big cheese, who are you? She wanted to have the ding-dong. and she started attacking me very vigorously.
Yeah,
and, you know, obviously I got a bit alarmed, but I like the spirit of it, and I always found that with her. Not a pompous person.
Yeah. Today's domestic environment is getting much more complex, and there's a view that number 10 is not fit for the decisions that require to be taken, and there needs to be more devolution or more consultation. And the international environment is now hugely complex. And that, how would she tackle that?
Well, I think she achieved some very great things in that respect, and she made one important mistake, which others have followed in the footsteps of. What she achieved was, particularly through establishing a proper policy unit, a very clear, much clearer idea of how the Prime Minister can direct the overall purposes of government, so that it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how you know what she wants. And the policy unit would therefore chase progress through different departments. In foreign policy, she was particularly good at that, and it was particularly difficult for the Foreign Office, but she was extremely successful at that with the Reagan relationship and with the Gorbachev relationship. Obviously much more scratchy with the EC.
And Yeltsin, was there a case for assisting Russia and Yeltsin at that time?
She was friendly to Yeltsin, but that was it was pretty much after she left office. But where I think she set an example which is unfortunate is that it was in her instinct to try to run too much and not to delegate. And since then, and much more nowadays, there's a sort of pseudo-presidential aspect to the number 10, which is bad, because it cuts the legs off cabinet ministers and it makes it impossible to... you can't run a government that way. I mean, it's too big. You have to have freestanding cabinet ministers who are important in their departments and are respected. And number 10 now, when Mrs Thatcher now employs 300 people in the building, when she was Prime Minister it employed 70. And it's just ridiculous. And so what you get now is these endless combat within number 10 and with the departments, a terrible amount of leaking, people fighting for the position at court. Yeah. Well, that always happens, but it does.
But I remember Nigel Lawson, for example, when he was Chancellor. He was against the poll tax, and he told me that he wasn't at the first cabinet subcommittee meeting. But the policy had a momentum all of its own.
Yes.
People knew this was going to be a disaster, but nothing happened
with
that.
This is true, but what is not true actually of the poll tax is that this was just Mrs Thatcher. It was I was surprised by this when I did the work on this. It was very iterated through government. So every department expressed their views. It went round and round, back and forth. The whole thing was sort of sealed and signed in blood, except, and you've made this point really, the Treasury, Nigel Lawson didn't want it. And for a new tax not to be wanted by the Chancellor is fatal. And somehow this was never dealt with. And Nigel sort of retired from the field. He's made his point, and he retired from the field because technically the tax came in under environment. Yeah,
but some would say that could be could have been or was a consequential moment.
It was.
And maybe Mrs Thatcher was in the downslope after that.
No, I think you're right about that. But it wasn't. Sometimes people think she sort of ran away with it all by herself. Almost all of them bought into it, and they were wrong. And it's surprising that she was wrong, because she was normally good at seeing the electoral effects of taxes. But she didn't realise the very simple point that if you invent a new tax and about 7 million more people are going to pay it than before, it's not going to be very popular.
Absolutely, yeah. There's issues there still today. I think I can quote you when you said that if one is in office for a long time, they always start to believe in having more power. And she, Mrs Thatcher, undoubtedly got that disease.
Yes, I think that's true. I think the passage of time means, among other things, that you tend to end up, if you were in as long as her, you tend to end up being the most senior. I mean, you are the most senior by your job, but you also... And this is why it went so badly wrong towards the end, because the two most important people in her governments, apart from her, were Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson. And And in the last period, they fell out with her.
Mm-hmm.
And once that doesn't work, nothing else works really. And so I think she had a very, very good, impressively successful premiership, regardless of whether you approve, from the beginning until after her third victory, 87. Mm-hmm. And then it quite quickly deteriorated, and it got really bad by 89, which was her 10th anniversary.
And you referred quite a bit in your book to Heseltine.
Yes.
And that issue. And
yes, and there, I mean, Heseltine behaved in a naughty way, but so did she. And it was an interesting example, the Westland crisis, because it was a sort of storm in a teacup. Mm-hmm. It didn't really matter what happened to a small helicopter factory in Yeovil. But it was a big storm in a teacup, and it showed up various things. But she did survive that. She did pull through. She did win the next election. But then, after that, and what she should have done was, what she always should have done was follow the advice of her husband Dennis in such matters. And on the 10th anniversary of her time in office, May 89, he said, "You should go now. This is a good moment to go." And she agreed with him, but not really. So she sort of played for time. And then she said, "Well, actually, I don't think the Queen would like it at this point," which was, I'm sure she just said that because she knew nobody would go and ask the Queen whether that was true or not. And she stayed on, and everything went wrong, terribly wrong, in the last 18 months.
Regarding an enduring legacy, some people would think her management of the miners' strike has had long-term adverse consequences. And also council housing, in the sense that it was a hugely popular policy. I know that from my own area when I was Member of Parliament. But now we have a housing crisis. Yeah. And if I'm correct, the rental situation with council housing is sort of over 50%. Over 50% is rented now instead of owned as a result of that. What should she have done in both of those cases?
I think in the council house case, it was fundamentally a successful policy and right. But what was badly wrong about it was that the Treasury took all the money. So what should have happened, and to be fair to her, she did want this, but she allowed herself to be overruled by the Treasury on this. There should have been a continued housing programme in which the government had a role, different from the form before. But anyway, that didn't happen, and it produced some of the consequences you describe. I think the actual emancipation of owning your council house was a good thing, and very important. On the miners' strike, I think, this is a controversial view, I think she did extremely well. I think she knew, she didn't want the strike, but she knew it would happen. You may remember that there was a threat of a strike 3 years earlier, and she gave in to it. Joe Gormley was then the leader, not Arthur Scargill, and she simply wasn't ready. She capitulated. She then prepared, which mainly meant coal stocks building up. And the thing was, she didn't want it, but she knew it would happen, and you had to win, because first of all, government's will has to prevail in the end. Secondly, the mining situation was ridiculous, and there were so many uneconomic pits. And thirdly, Scargill was trying to bring her down, explicitly. Not just her, but her government. It was a highly political, extreme strike. And
by the way, Neil Kinnock has been interviewed by me here just recently, and he's vociferous in that view.
Yes.
He knew it was a failure from day one.
Absolutely right, and I felt very sorry for him at the time, because he couldn't really, because of the sort of solidarity idea in Labour, he couldn't really properly say that. And so I think she had to do it, and I think she behaved actually with reasonable restraint, and she did the necessary. The stocks increased, what they call endurance. She national police coordination so that you could not be outwitted by the pickets, and reform of the trade union laws so that the funds of the National Union of Mine Workers could be distrained if they broke the law, rather than the criminal path which had been followed by Ted Heath unsuccessfully. So I think she thought about it, she got it right, and she carried her party and cabinet with her. I think it's a very impressive achievement. And of course it was wretched what happened in the in mining villages. But do remember that Arthur Scargill wouldn't have a ballot. And
Nottinghamshire.
And Nottinghamshire and wider, Derbyshire and quite a lot of, and increasingly across, they very understandably resented this. Why should they put their working lives on the line for all this. And so it was tragic, but I do really think that Scargill should be blamed.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of it from a modern point of view, that the communities, the legacy is still there in communities, and perhaps it could have been done differently with a long-term view.
Yes, it could, and it would have been if Scargill hadn't struck. Because the interesting trick question is which Prime Minister reduced the number of mines the most, and the answer is Harold Wilson. And this is just because of the natural trend of all of this. It wasn't sort of great ideology on the side of either party.
Talking about Harold Wilson, would you reassess his tenure as Prime Minister? Given that he closed more mines, wasn't blamed for it. In Europe, he got the referendum, wasn't blamed for it.
Yes.
He always wanted to be in Europe, but was very deft.
He was very deft, and that should be recognised. And nobody else, I think, has won election 4 times. But I think in the end, you do ask yourself, what did it all amount to? Did it really matter? Did he bring things that we really needed? I think it's a bit disappointing.
Can I take you on to the Cameron period, 2010? You criticised them for embracing what the left, they had ceded to the left, that you said, whether it be health, whether it be welfare, whether it be environment, whether it be education.
Yes, I think David Cameron is an astute politician and a decent man. And until the referendum made some successes. But I think in the end, 2 problems. One is that he was a sort of good time politician when the times weren't very good. So he was hoping to be Tony Blair, that everything's getting better all the time. And actually, there was a financial crisis and so on. And another was that you do need to have the courage of your convictions in politics. And I think this is the genius of Mrs Thatcher, is that she knew what she believed and was very good at expressing it. So it didn't make everybody like her or agree, but it's very powerful, that. And Cameron didn't really have that. So you end up, he was considered to be a reformer, but I see him as an establishment figure. But what I mean is that actually he did the old-fashioned Tory thing of just trying to keep a fairly decent show on the road. Well, now you can do a lot worse than that, and we have. But that, I think, is not so fascinating and impressive.
Mm-hmm. The use of the word in phone hacking in 2011, and I was quite surprised to read a quote which you were alleged to say, and you said that the hacking, you asked the question, had the left been right all along? Not only Murdoch's power, Rupert Murdoch's power, but whether, quote, the free market is a setup.
Yes.
There's quite a lot in that.
Was that about hacking?
Yeah, it was 2011, yeah, around the time of the hacking.
What I think I was raising, but I think there might be sort of eliding 2 things there. On the point about the free market being a setup, what I think the financial crisis brought out is that capitalism wasn't serving people enough. It was serving capitalists too much. And so the banks that are supposed to be for us were in fact for the banks. And when the banks went wrong, it was we that had to pay for the banks. And
I chaired the Treasury Committee for 10 years during that crisis.
Yeah.
So,
you will know much more.
But those were the points I was making, so you're reinforcing that.
But actually that doesn't lead me to be against free markets, because what I'm against is the sort of protection of illegitimate interests. And I think that we got in hock, because of debt, the whole Western world got in hock to very great banking power. And this was the fault also of central banks, not just of investment banks, and of political leaders. And this still goes on. So this is why there's so much popular discontent, is all through the Western world, there is a pretty successful class of people who move in and out of government and do quite well out of it. Takes different forms in different countries, but you know what I'm talking about, and that's hence the resentment against sort of Davos man and all that type of thing. And the gradual amelioration of what the Victorians call the condition of the people has weakened. So real wages have not really risen and so on. And so people naturally ask themselves, how is this getting better for me? Why is my waiting time at A&E increasing? Why am I paying so much tax when I'm not earning more? Why are my electricity bills so high because of net zero impositions and so on? And when you put it all together, and also you add political correctness to that, so that indigenous white people feel they're actually being picked on, you're asking for trouble. And that is essentially the rulers of Western countries have been asking for trouble for a long time now. So now they've got it.
Mm-hmm. So what's the way forward in that? I mean, I don't want to get into the present situation, tariffs or whatever else, but US treasuries, a quarter of US treasuries are owned overseas, other in American itself. Yeah. And therefore there's an interdependence on the whole system. And that interdependence perhaps means that there is a limit in how much change could be enforced without bringing down the system itself.
Yes, and this is a possibly insoluble question. And it's why, though I think he's done some good things, particularly internally, I think Trump is a menace because the risks are too high without the clear benefits. And the tariffs would be a classic example. So it's very understandable because actually the world is constantly full of far more tariffs and non-tariff barriers than is admitted. And Trump says that, and he's right about that, but his solution is just to ratchet it up. And similarly, in questions of world peace, he doesn't seem to understand that you do need a rules-based international order. And I think there's a difference between global interdependence, which is in many ways a good thing, and globalization, or globalism, which is in many ways a bad thing because of the power it gives to elites. I remember Mervyn King put this very well to me once. He said, these great international banks is all fine when the things are going well, and they're global in life, fine. But it's jolly well not fine because they come home to die.
Yeah, exactly.
And they come home to Britain or France or America, whatever, and die. And they die at our expense. And that's it's a very great problem. But you do need to you don't solve it, but you do need to improve it by greater democratic accountability. And this is what all these revolts are about. What Brexit was about, and probably the popularity of reform is about, and Trump, and often the answers produced by the populists are no good, but they're onto something important, and it's no good just the elites rejecting it all the time and looking down on the people who are complaining. Yeah, and I think that's a sort of long-term problem we're dealing with.
And some would say that Trump spoke to the heartlands, to those left behind, to those whose wages, as you mentioned earlier, hasn't really increased in real terms since the 70s in, say, the United States as a result of that.
He did, and he does. But his measures, as we can now see, are already hitting them. So, I mean, like the difficulties of American farmers over tariffs, for example. I mean, it's and unfortunately, I don't think he's a clever man, Trump, and a brilliant politician in a way, but he's not. He is really acting selfishly, I would say. So he's not actually really thinking what's going to be the best. He's thinking, how am I going to dominate everything?
Yeah. The New Labour's constitutional reforms, you're very critical of them, including the establishment of the Supreme Court and the subsequent changes to the role of the House of Lords. And maybe I can say in here, you want me out of a job quick. Because you don't want the Lord Speaker's job. You
Well, nothing
want to go
personal.
back, so I understand that.
No, I think that it was a great mistake. We may be getting a bit technical here, but we are the House of Lords after all. I think it was a great mistake of Tony Blair to abolish the Lord Chancellorship. By the way, you could probably nevertheless have a Lord Speakership. That might be it's not the most key question here, but he, in that very sort of casual way that Tony Blair had, he sort of more or less decided over a weekend, why do we have to have the Lord Chancellor?
By the way, I was involved at that particular time, and you talk about hasty decisions. There was a view it could be done by lunchtime,
yes.
And the Scottish office disappeared, but there was still a constitutional link with the Scottish office.
Yes.
So, as far as I know from my information, is that they sent workmen up in the morning to take the plate off Dover House, Scottish office, had lunch and realised the constitutional implications and sent the workers back in the afternoon to put it up again. So,
well, I believe you. I mean, and the thing is, because the British Constitution is historical, which I mean in a good way, not logical, you do have to be careful. And it's a case, the famous Shakespeare line, "Untune that string and hark what discord follows," has been the case.
Peter Hennessy, good chaps theory.
Yes, but it's more than good chaps. You can be quite bad chap and still be well governed by conventions. Conventions, as you know better than I in our house, are very important. They're more important than rules actually, because we all consent, or mostly we consent to the conventions, and therefore we behave with a certain restraint. And that's one reason I'm very against the Supreme Court, because I thought it was good under the old system where technically the law lords were a judicial committee of the House of Lords. Actually, they were professional lawyers, but and therefore the system acknowledged the fact that government includes the judiciary, though in operational terms it's completely different from the judiciary, but the whole idea of government includes the judiciary, and the judiciary should not be supreme and separate. I don't mean it should take political orders, but it should be, it shouldn't be setting itself up. The paradox of what New Labour did, is that by creating an apparently more independent judiciary, they actually created a more political judiciary. And that's what we have now, and that's what we have with human rights laws, and this is all anti the common law tradition, and it's bad for parliamentary democracy.
Yeah. When you were editor of the Daily Telegraph, you took a momentous decision by employing a certain young Boris Johnson. So I can't let you off with that before you leave here.
Well, I won't make any excuses, but I didn't. He was already employed, but I did promote him, and rightly so, because he was the most brilliant columnist, and he was also, I made him comment editor, he was less reliable on that, but he was a brilliant columnist, and he is a brilliant journalist. So I don't regret that. He, very good example actually of how a journalist can make a difference. Some would say not 100% to the good, but nevertheless, it's a very striking career. And his particular capacity in journalism is to he's very good at picking the moment. Sort of he sees something, and then he turns it. He has a very good imagination, and comic imagination, of course, too. And he can sort of take a moment and turn it, and say suddenly you think about it in a different way, and you want to read it, and you want to hear what he has to say. And obviously he sails close to the wind, but that in journalism is not a fault.
No. How would you assess his premiership, and knowing him very well?
Well, I think it was absolutely brilliant performance in winning the referendum, which really was more down to him than anyone else, and even more so in winning the leadership and winning the general election. I mean, that's an astonishing thing to do in those circumstances. And it was strategically right, because get Brexit done, that's what people thought, and they were entitled to vote for that. And then, of course, COVID came along, so we'll never know what would have happened if Boris had been a Prime Minister in ordinary times. But of course, for all sorts of reasons, people turned against him over that. And there's no doubt that he's very sloppy. I don't think I thought it was ridiculous to say that he behaved with terrible immorality about these so-called parties and things, but he's so sloppy. So he doesn't do the work properly.
So that was a contrast with Mrs Thatcher?
Very much. Mm-hmm. He's not lazy. Well, what I call Boris is a lazy workaholic. So he's always working, but he doesn't do it sort of in a consecutive, proper way. So he's always desperately grabbing the next piece of paper because he's late for the meeting. And so the level of disorganization then produces internal disagreements and then ultimately mutiny. And that was much more likely to happen under COVID than under normal circumstances. But also there was a simple desire for revenge for a lot of people within the Tory party, which unfortunately always happens in these occasions. So he made terrible mistakes and he paid for it. I think actually though that it was wrong to push him out, because when somebody's pushed out, and I saw this with Mrs Thatcher too for very different reasons, when somebody's pushed out, bad blood enters the system in a way that does not happen when they lose elections. Mm-hmm. And general elections. And so the ensuing mess in the Conservative government and party was less to do with Boris, though he's certainly not blameless, than to do with getting rid of him. Mm-hmm. And if he got everything wrong, he deserved to lose at a general election, not in a coup. Mm-hmm. And then it's coup after coup after coup, and maybe one soon again.
Yeah. Has the Tory party got over Thatcher? I think myself, an example, on the night that she was deposed, I was in the members' lobby of the House of Commons, and I met a hugely supportive Thatcher supporter, and chatting away and saying, well, look, you'll not want to talk to me tonight, so I'll just let you go. Oh, no, Johnny says, how about coming for a pint with me? He says, because I'd rather have it with you than some of those stop the clock element. But so therefore that intensity was there. Is that lessened, and has Thatcher legacy been overcome, or is it still? Well,
it's a good, you put the question very well by framing it in that way, because I do a little drama with a colleague about this, a semi-dramatisation of the fall of Mrs Thatcher when we sort of acted out, because it was very, very dramatic, and it's a bit of a whodunit and a bit of a Greek tragedy. And you see this great political beast being brought down by a whole load of plotting. And in many ways she deserved to go, and she'd outstayed her welcome and so on. But it's a horrible thing to see, particularly the only woman being brought down by all these men who owed their positions to her. And it meant that people regard it as disgraceful, even if they weren't sorry to see the back of her. And it was rather disgraceful. And of course on it goes. And it also issued in ideological disagreements too, like about Europe. Mm-hmm. And all that is still there, though I do think it is diminished. But you still have to, Thatcher is still, as Churchill was in my youth, now it's Thatcher that Conservatives have to sort of understand what their relationship with her is, and it's she that gets invoked, sometimes criticised, of course, but she's the big one, as Churchill was and still is. And therefore all debates sort of work around that. And it's been very difficult for women leaders, of whom there have now been 3. Mm-hmm. Because should you be like Mrs Thatcher or not like Mrs Thatcher as a woman leader?
All in the Conservative Party.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. And yes, Labour still hasn't dared have a woman. And it's a real difficulty for them. Trying to be like her is dangerous. Not learning from her example is also dangerous.
Mm-hmm. You've criticised individuals in the House of Commons largely, I think, about the politicization of the civil service. Is reform of the civil service the answer to these issues? It seems what you say, cock-canny approach, a Scottish phrase, take it easy.
Trouble is, it's so big, isn't it? It's so all-consuming. One thing that happened, and this happened under Mrs Thatcher and developed and has had the dangerous effects, is that there's been the creation of a whole load of bodies that are called independent, who operate things. But in my view, they're not independent, and indeed they shouldn't be, because these are things that should be answerable to Parliament. But they've been shuffled off from government departments so that you can't know the electorate or their representatives can't get a handle on them. Mm-hmm. So one example would be the Climate Change Committee, which just goes on and on laying down the law without any democratic validation at all. Created by legislation, fair enough, I mean, it's entitled to do that, but it's as if MPs had ceased to see that they are the people who matter. And similarly with the civil service, I think both sides have behaved badly, because I think the government has often behaved disgracefully, both parties, in condemning officials in public. It's quite wrong.
Mm-hmm. Ken Clarke was a good example of that. You know, I think where civil servants, a number of occasions, few occasions, screwed up, but Ken took the hit when he came to the House.
He understood this responsibility point. So this has got very bad in government, but it's also got very bad with the civil servants, and the sort of reciprocal badness, because they frequently denounce policies in a way that they mustn't. And that's partly why I was annoyed about Black Lives Matter. There shouldn't be all these logos and things like that in public service. Absolutely not, none of them. Nobody should wear any lanyards or badges or anything, except that of the crown, as it were. And civil servants move in and out of the jobs, and the impartiality is taken much less seriously. I don't really agree with the radical Tory position that you've got to have a very politicised civil service. There's a role, important role, for a small number of SPADs or words to that effect. You've got to have some political thrust in the system. But essentially, I actually do believe in the impartial civil service, and I think it's been degraded by both sides. Also, like everything now, there are unrigorous admissions. So one of the most striking things I see as a historian is the unbelievably low quality of government internal communication compared with what it was 30 years ago. Yeah. All those things written by Cabinet Secretary, Robert Armstrong, Robin Butler, private secretaries like Charles Pell, beautiful English, totally clear, very economical, and now there's sort of stuff pouring out which is almost not English. And you can't sack people if they're no good, and it's all, if you look at the Foreign Office particularly, it's low grade, and diversity and inclusion has done terrible damage to all of this, because people are appointed for token reasons, not for real reasons.
Well, when I was the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, I made the point that politicians have franchised the responsibility largely to outside bodies, regulators, and it's difficult to get a handle on that, to get a grip.
Absolutely, but the trouble is, it's also very hard. It was very hard before when they didn't do that, because they were running all sorts of things they're not qualified to run, such as nationalised industries. So it really is difficult. And I've got no ready answer to that, though I think on the whole privatisation, except for monopolies, was a good thing, because there were a whole load of things that government couldn't sensibly run but was running. But yes, so you're right. I mean, these regulators are not remarkably easy. It would seem surprising to the outsider, because I don't think most of them are corrupt, but they're quite easy to manipulate in some way. How did we get to this situation with water, for example? This is another reason, as part of this great public disaffection, is I vote for somebody, but it doesn't make any difference.
They're all the same. They're all the same.
They're all the same, and it's not just because it's not just because you don't think much of them as individuals. It's just that somehow or other nobody can get a grip. If you get a poll about what do they think about their local MP, most people are quite favourable to their local MP. There aren't many who say this person's absolutely useless, and they have quite a lot of often good relationship with the constituency, work and surgery and things like that. But it's collectively, we vote and nothing happens. And I'm afraid I think that's what's happening now, because Labour got this terrifically large majority with a very low vote, and there's obviously that's unusual, and it's a big disconnect. And there's a sort of, it said change in big letters. What is the change?
Okay. I mentioned about your Catholic faith, and now we've had Pope Francis dying very recently, and I think you have written an article on that, but could you take us further on that? Obviously, he's made a huge impression globally as a result. I mean, even at the weekend, football matches, there was a minute's silence for him elsewhere. And I've had emails from individuals who don't have any religion, but have recognised him for that. In many ways, he was ahead of the times, some would say, with his encyclical Laudate Si on the environment. Perhaps you'd disagree with that, but on the economic situation, and on AI, where in 2016 he had the tech companies and Nobel laureates looking at these particular issues.
Yes.
But your view of Francis and what you as a Catholic think the Church needs for the future?
Well, I think in a weird way, the papacy has become much more important in the modern world, because it used to be enough for people to think there is a pope, but we don't really know who he is. He's some Italian sitting there, and he's not going to come out. I mean, for many years they were prisoner of the Vatican, in the famous phrase. But in the age of mass media, they are really global figures as individuals as well as in the office, and that really took off with Pope John Paul II, and who was enormously influential and successful, and really pivotal in the Cold War, the ending of the Cold War.
And you could say he was responsible for the establishment of solidarity as a major force.
Exactly, and of course he also embodied it very well, because he's a very sort of powerful speaker and impressive man. And he and Francis, I would say, were the two who've really sort of benefited from that mass attention. I actually would be quite critical of Pope Francis in various ways, because I don't think he's very good at running things. He was quite sort of...
Shades of Boris.
He's quite sort of factional and bad-tempered, and that sort of thing. But and I think not the most fantastic brain. He's not one of the great intellectuals of the. But I think he brilliantly understood the importance of the famous image of the bishop, and ultimately, particularly of the Bishop of Rome, is of a shepherd, and he's caring for his flock, and he gets his hands dirty with his flock, and I think he's brilliant at that, and therefore he's somehow always good at getting to the point that matters to people about who is suffering, who is poor. I often think his policy solutions, as is often the case with great men, are wrong, but it's very important to embody all that all the time. Washing the feet of somebody. This is not new, but it's symbolically tremendous. And I'm glad to say that sort of modern media convey that, actually.
Mm-hmm. In the future, what should the Church be looking at? What type of leader does it need now? Does it need a different type of leader?
I think if you look sort of inside the engine room of the Catholic Church, you'll find tremendous problems about money, about some doctrinal issues, about manpower, about how to run things. And this is left in a pretty poor state, actually. And so somebody's got to take a grip of that. But one mustn't forget, on the other hand, what I've just been talking about the Pope's unique capacity for, as people now always call it, soft power. And so if you don't have, one of the most important things that a religious leader has is, what's sometimes called a prophetic gift. And so if you have a bureaucrat in, you won't have a prophetic gift. So it's a real problem. Mm-hmm. And the only other thing I'd say is that despite being a Roman Catholic, I'm not a tremendous papist. I don't think we should be too dictated to by a pope. The pope is the beloved and respected head, but I don't believe in sort of Pius IX sort of fierce enforcement of everything.
So therefore you see him as the Bishop of Rome?
Yes, and also of a great global father, right. But not of sort of warfare.
Okay. Could I take you on to the geopolitical situation, because you've given us a tremendous amount of time and been very patient. We have the Middle East and we have Ukraine, and you recently visited Ukraine. What should we be doing in that area, and what's the way forward for ourselves, Europe and others?
Well, I think President Trump's interventions in Ukraine are disastrous, because though I think he's sincere about wanting peace, he doesn't understand that peace must last, and therefore has to be based on justice and on a sense of the world order. And when he says that Zelensky started the war, Ukraine started the war, it's just stupefyingly untrue. And so it might be true, I don't particularly agree with it, but Russia might have reasonable positions about how its interests are important in the region and need to be considered, and there are some people in Ukraine who want to be with Russia, not many now, but so on. But Putin's actions ruled him completely out of order. And that has to be recognised, and people have to act accordingly. And unfortunately, the allies, NATO allies, didn't do nearly enough about it in 2014, and now therefore paying a very high price. Crimea and other related matters. And now paying a very, very high price. Trump's challenge to the Europeans is reasonable to step up. But it's only reasonable if America itself is going to perform its role. We're all allies together in this. But Trump is talking about A, solving the situation, but B, not living with the result. He's sort of talking about just getting out. That's impossible. And so I don't think his mission can succeed, and I think a great deal of damage be done. And I think the Europeans do have to work out how to have both a short-term and a long-term defence, security strategy.
So European solidarity is essential.
Yes, but I don't think that's likely to come through primarily through the EU. I think it's likely to come through a sort of revived, more European NATO.
Lastly, you're a fan of real ale.
I was. I still am, but I'm a bit too old to drink beer.
Right.
Much.
Well, as Lord Speaker, I have been lobbied by members who live in the north and say, look, we want beer in the Bishop's Bar to reflect the whole country, and we have introduced real ale. So what I'll do to solidify the solidarity here, Lord Moore, is to invite you for a pint in the Bishop's Bar with me paying.
That's very, I gratefully accept, particularly on the final point. That's marvellous.
Well, look, thanks for your time. I know you have other engagements, but it's been very, very
I've enjoyed it very
fruitful.
much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.